Captain Marcus Thornfield had served the royal family for 15 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he witnessed that cold October morning. The newly crowned King Alexander III lay unconscious on the marble floor of his private study, a thin trickle of blood running from his temple. Standing over him, her hands still raised and trembling, was Queen Consort Isabella, her emerald eyes wide with what appeared to be both shock and fury. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. Marcus had arrived early for his routine security briefing, using his master key to enter through the servants' passage as he had done countless times before. The sight that greeted him defied everything he understood about royal protocol and human decency. Isabella's pristine white morning gown was wrinkled, suggesting some form of struggle. Her usually perfect auburn hair had escaped its elegant pins, framing her pale face in disheveled waves. Most striking of all was the heavy crystal paperweight clutched in her right hand, its surface stained with something dark that Marcus's trained eye immediately recognized as blood. The king stirred slightly, groaning as consciousness began to return. Marcus instinctively stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding the paralysis that had initially gripped him. Isabella's head snapped toward him, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes met. In that gaze, Marcus saw not the composed, charitable woman who had charmed the nation during her courtship with the king, but someone desperate and cornered. "Captain Thornfield?" Isabella's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried an authority that made Marcus pause mid-stride. "You weren't supposed to see this." The weight of those words settled over Marcus like a heavy cloak. Whatever had transpired in this room, he was now an unwitting witness to something that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. King Alexander had been crowned just 3 months earlier, following his father's sudden death from a heart attack. The transition had been smooth, largely due to Isabella's unwavering support and the public's adoration of their fairy tale romance. Marcus had been personally assigned to the king's protection detail 2 years ago during the engagement period. He had watched Alexander transform from a carefree prince into a serious monarch, shouldering responsibilities that would have crushed lesser men. The king was known for his compassion, his dedication to social reform, and his deep love for his new bride. The idea that Isabella could harm him seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, his training taking over as he assessed the situation. "I need to call for medical assistance immediately." Isabella's grip tightened on the paperweight, and Marcus noticed her knuckles were bruised, as if she had been in some kind of physical altercation. "No," she said firmly, "not yet. There are things you need to understand first." King Alexander's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on the ornate ceiling above. When he tried to sit up, Marcus moved to assist him, but Isabella raised her free hand in a gesture that was both commanding and pleading. "Don't move, Alexander," she said, her voice carrying an odd mixture of concern and warning. "You've been hurt." The king's gaze found his wife's face, and Marcus watched a complex array of emotions play across the monarch's features. Confusion gave way to what appeared to be fear, then anger, and finally something that looked disturbingly like resignation. "Isabella," the king said slowly, each word seeming to cause him physical pain, "what have you done?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Marcus felt the weight of history pressing down upon him, understanding instinctively that whatever happened next would either destroy the monarchy or save it from something far worse than a domestic dispute. Isabella's composure began to crack, tears forming in her eyes as she looked down at her injured husband. "I had no choice, Alexander. You wouldn't listen. You were going to destroy everything our families have worked for, everything this country needs." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications of her words. As head of the king's personal security, he was privy to many state secrets, but clearly not all of them. There were layers of intrigue here that went far beyond a simple marital disagreement. The study around them bore witness to some kind of struggle. Books had been pulled from their shelves, papers scattered across the Persian rug, and the king's desk had been ransacked. Whatever had led to this confrontation had been brewing for some time, and Marcus realized he was seeing only the violent culmination of a much larger conspiracy. King Alexander struggled to sit up, pressing a hand to his bleeding temple. "The documents," he said weakly. "You found the documents." Isabella's face hardened, and for a moment she looked every inch the aristocrat she had been born to be. Her family, the powerful House of Ravencroft, had been instrumental in financing Alexander's father's reign, and their marriage had been as much a political alliance as a romantic union. "Those documents would have ruined us all," Isabella said coldly. "The arms deals, the offshore accounts, the arrangements with the generals. Did you really think you could expose everything and expect to survive?" Marcus felt his blood run cold. Arms deals and offshore accounts suggested corruption at the highest levels of government, possibly involving foreign powers. As a career military man who had sworn an oath to protect the crown, he found himself caught between his duty to the king and his growing understanding that the situation was far more complex than it appeared. The king's voice grew stronger as he spoke, though he remained seated on the floor. "The people deserve to know the truth, Isabella. My father may have made these arrangements, but I won't continue them. The weapons sales to unstable regions, the bribes to foreign officials, the money laundering through royal charities, it all ends now." Isabella laughed bitterly. "Your naivety would be charming if it weren't so dangerous. Do you think the generals who helped finance your coronation will simply accept the loss of billions in contracts? Do you think the foreign ministers who paid for access will quietly fade away?" Marcus began to understand the true scope of what he had stumbled into. This wasn't just a domestic dispute between newlyweds. It was a conflict between old power structures and a king who apparently wanted to clean house. Isabella represented the established order, the shadowy network of deals and compromises that had kept the monarchy financially solvent but morally compromised. The sound of footsteps in the outer corridor made all three of them freeze. Marcus realized that the morning shift change was approaching, and soon other guards would be making their rounds. Whatever decision was to be made about this situation needed to happen quickly. "We have perhaps 5 minutes before others arrive," Marcus said quietly. "Your Majesty, you need medical attention. Your Majesty," he turned to Isabella, "you need to put down the weapon." Isabella looked at the blood-stained paperweight as if seeing it for the first time. "Weapon," she repeated softly. "Is that what this is? I thought it was justice." King Alexander managed to get to his knees, though the effort clearly cost him. Justice would be allowing the truth to come to light. Justice would be ending the corruption that has stained our family's name for generations. Justice, Isabella spat, would be preserving the stability that keeps this nation from falling into chaos. Do you know what happens to countries when their governments collapse overnight? Do you know what happens to the people you claim to care about when foreign powers move in to fill the vacuum? Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of witnessing a philosophical and political debate between the two highest-ranking members of the royal family, while one bled from a head wound and the other held a potential murder weapon. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing quite like this. The king's next words sent a chill through the room. "The generals are planning a coup, aren't they? That's why you're so desperate to stop me. It's not about the money or the corruption, it's about preventing a military takeover." Isabella's silence was answer enough. Marcus felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. The rushed coronation after the old king's sudden death, the increased military presence around the capital, the secret meetings that even he, as head of security, had not been informed about. "They promised you would be spared," the king continued, his voice gaining strength as his anger grew. "They promised that if you could keep me in line, prevent me from exposing the network, they would allow the monarchy to continue. But what happens when they no longer need us, Isabella? What happens when they decide the royal family has outlived its usefulness?" The queen consort's hand began to shake, and Marcus tensed, ready to move if she raised the paperweight again. But instead of striking, she slowly lowered her arm, the weight of her husband's words settling over her like a shroud. "You don't understand," she whispered. "My brother is one of them. My father arranged everything before he died. If the network falls, our entire family falls with it. They'll find evidence of treason, tax evasion, connections to foreign enemies. They'll destroy us completely." Marcus suddenly understood why Isabella had been so desperate. This wasn't just about preserving corruption. It was about survival. The Ravencroft family had been so deeply embedded in the shadowy financial arrangements that they couldn't extract themselves without facing ruin or worse. The sound of approaching voices in the corridor grew louder. Marcus knew he had to make a decision that would affect not just his own future, but the future of the entire kingdom. He could report what he had seen, triggering an investigation that might expose the corruption, but could also destabilize the government. He could remain silent, allowing the status quo to continue, but becoming complicit in whatever crimes had been committed. Or he could try to find a third option, one that might save both the monarchy and the nation. "Your Majesties," Marcus said quietly, "I believe we may have a very short window of opportunity to change the course of events, but it will require trust, courage, and a willingness to risk everything." King Alexander looked up at his loyal guard with something approaching hope, while Isabella's expression remained guarded but desperate. Outside, the voices grew closer, and Marcus knew that whatever they decided in the next few moments would echo through history. The ornate clock chimed once more, marking the quarter hour, and Marcus began to outline a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. In a kingdom built on secrets and shadows, sometimes the only way to preserve the light was to embrace an even deeper darkness. The plan Marcus proposed was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. As the voices in the corridor grew closer, he quickly outlined a strategy that would buy them time while potentially exposing the entire conspiracy. King Alexander would need to appear as though nothing unusual had happened, while Isabella would have to play the role of the devoted wife, rather than the desperate conspirator she had revealed herself to be. "The morning briefing with General Harrison is in 30 minutes, Marcus explained in hushed tones as he helped the king to his feet. "If we can get you cleaned up and present a united front, we might be able to gather evidence of the coup before they realize their plan has been compromised." Isabella's eyes darted between her husband and the loyal guard, weighing options that all seemed to lead to disaster. "You don't understand the scope of this, Captain. General Harrison isn't just planning a coup, he's already begun implementing it. Half the military command is loyal to him, and the other half doesn't know what's happening until it's too late." King Alexander steadied himself against his desk, his royal bearing returning despite the blood still trickling from his temple. "Then we use what advantages we have. Marcus, how many guards can you personally trust with your life?" The question struck at the heart of Marcus's dilemma. In his 15 years of service, he had built relationships throughout the royal guard, but absolute trust was a luxury few in their profession could afford. "6 men, Your Majesty, perhaps 8 if we include the overnight shift commanders." "That's not enough," Isabella said grimly. "Harrison has been recruiting within the guard for months. Some of your most trusted colleagues are already compromised." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. His own unit, the men he had trained and served alongside, had been infiltrated by conspiracy. The bonds of brotherhood he had counted on were potentially worthless, and worse, actively dangerous. A sharp knock on the study door made them all freeze. "Your Majesty," came the voice of Lieutenant Crawford, Marcus's second-in-command. "The morning security briefing is ready for your review." Marcus caught the king's eye and received a barely perceptible nod. "Just a moment, Lieutenant," Marcus called out. "His Majesty is finishing some correspondence." The next few minutes were a carefully choreographed dance of deception. Isabella quickly arranged the scattered papers on the desk, while Marcus used his own handkerchief to clean the blood from the king's temple. The cut was deeper than it had initially appeared, but fortunately, it was in an area that could be concealed by the king's hair if positioned correctly. King Alexander's natural charisma served him well as he composed himself, straightening his posture and schooling his features into the calm, confident expression his subjects expected. Only the slight tremor in his hands betrayed the magnitude of what had just transpired. "Isabella," the king said quietly, "you need to understand that whatever happens next, I won't abandon you. But I also won't abandon my duty to the crown and the people. We find a way through this together, or we face the consequences together." The queen consort's composure cracked slightly, revealing the frightened young woman beneath the aristocratic facade. "The consequences may be death, Alexander, for all of us." Marcus opened the door to admit Lieutenant Crawford, a man he had worked with for 3 years and genuinely liked. Crawford's easy smile and professional demeanor had always been reassuring, but now Marcus found himself analyzing every gesture for signs of betrayal. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Crawford said with a crisp salute. "The perimeter is secure, and we've received no unusual intelligence overnight. General Harrison is expected to arrive for the briefing in 20 minutes. King Alexander nodded graciously, giving no indication of the crisis that had just unfolded. "Excellent. Lieutenant, I want you to personally ensure that the conference room is swept for any electronic surveillance before the general arrives. Captain Thornfield and I have some sensitive matters to discuss." Crawford's expression didn't change, but Marcus noticed a slight hesitation before he responded. "Of course, Your Majesty. Should I have the technical team conduct a full sweep, or would you prefer a more discreet inspection?" The question was innocent enough, but something in Crawford's tone set off alarm bells in Marcus's mind. Why would he suggest a discreet sweep unless he was concerned about someone monitoring their conversation? And who would that someone be? "A full technical sweep, Lieutenant," the king replied firmly. "I want to ensure complete privacy for today's discussions." After Crawford left, the three conspirators, for that's what they had become, huddled together to refine their desperate strategy. Isabella revealed more details about the conspiracy that painted an even darker picture than Marcus had initially imagined. "The arms deals aren't just about money," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're about creating instability in specific regions so that Harrison's private military contractors can secure lucrative peacekeeping contracts. The offshore accounts fund political campaigns in countries where we want to influence elections." King Alexander's face grew pale as the full scope of his father's legacy became clear. "How many governments are involved?" "At least 12 that I know of," Isabella replied. "And that's just the active operations. There are dormant accounts and relationships going back decades." Marcus felt the weight of international conspiracy settling over them. This wasn't just about domestic corruption or even a military coup. It was about a shadow network that operated across borders and influenced global politics. The implications were staggering. The king's next question revealed the depth of his commitment to ending the conspiracy, despite the personal cost. What would happen if we released everything publicly? All the documents, all the account numbers, all the communications? Isabella's response was immediate and chilling. Global economic chaos in the short term, the collapse of several allied governments, and almost certainly our own deaths within 48 hours. And if we do nothing, the military takes control of the kingdom within weeks. We become puppet rulers for a few years until we're no longer useful, and then we have convenient accidents. Marcus realized they were discussing options that existed on a spectrum between immediate destruction and delayed destruction. There seemed to be no path that led to actual survival, only different ways to die. The arrival of General Harrison's motorcade was announced by the distant sound of sirens and the increased radio chatter Marcus could hear through his earpiece. A man in his late 50s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, Harrison had been a war hero before transitioning into military administration. His reputation was impeccable, his service record flawless, and his loyalty to the crown supposedly absolute. "He's charming," Isabella warned as they prepared to face the general. "He'll make everything sound reasonable, patriotic, even noble. He's been planning this for years, and he believes completely that what he's doing is for the good of the kingdom." King Alexander adjusted his tie and squared his shoulders. "Then we play our parts perfectly. Isabella, you're the dutiful wife who supports whatever decision I make. Marcus, you're the loyal guard who notices nothing unusual. And I'm the naive young king who's grateful for the general's guidance." The performance that followed was worthy of the finest theatrical productions. General Harrison swept into the conference room with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command, offering respectful greetings and genuine-seeming concern for the king's welfare. "Your Majesty, you look tired," Harrison observed with what appeared to be fatherly concern. "The burden of kingship is considerable, especially for one so young. I hope you're finding time to rest." King Alexander smiled with just the right amount of weary gratitude. "Your concern is appreciated, General. I confess the responsibility does weigh heavily at times. I find myself questioning whether I'm making the right decisions." Marcus watched the exchange with growing unease. The general's responses were perfectly calibrated, each word chosen to reinforce the king's self-doubt while offering the promise of guidance and support. It was psychological manipulation of the highest order. "Doubt is natural," Harrison replied smoothly. "Your father experienced the same uncertainty when he first took the throne, but he learned to trust those with experience, to rely on the wisdom of advisors who had served the crown for decades." Isabella played her part flawlessly, offering small gestures of support for her husband while carefully avoiding any sign of the morning's violent confrontation. Her aristocratic training served her well, as she navigated the treacherous conversation. The briefing covered routine security matters for the first 20 minutes, but Marcus could sense Harrison building toward something more significant. The general's questions became more probing, his suggestions more pointed. "Your Majesty," Harrison said finally, "I've been reviewing the economic reports with the Treasury ministers. The kingdom's financial position is more precarious than we've publicly acknowledged. The previous administration's spending on social programs has strained our resources considerably." King Alexander leaned forward with apparent interest, though Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders. "What do you recommend, General?" "We need to consider alternative revenue sources. There are international opportunities that could significantly improve our position, partnerships with private security firms and defense contractors that could prove quite lucrative." The conversation had reached the heart of the conspiracy. Marcus found himself holding his breath as the king prepared to respond to what was essentially an invitation to join the corrupt network. "That sounds promising," King Alexander said carefully. "What sort of partnerships are you thinking of?" Harrison's smile was perfectly measured, revealing just enough enthusiasm to seem genuine while maintaining professional restraint. "There are regions experiencing instability that would benefit from our expertise in conflict resolution. Our military advisors could provide valuable services while generating substantial returns for the Treasury." Marcus understood that they were discussing the deployment of British military resources as mercenaries, dressed up in diplomatic language. It was treason disguised as patriotism, and the general was presenting it as a reasonable solution to fiscal problems. Isabella chose that moment to make her contribution to the deception. "That sounds wonderfully practical, General Harrison. Alexander has been so worried about the kingdom's finances. Haven't you, darling?" The endearment was perfectly delivered, carrying just the right amount of wifely affection and concern. But Marcus caught the brief flash of something darker in her eyes, a mixture of fear and determination that suggested she was committing fully to their dangerous charade. King Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, the financial pressures are considerable. Perhaps we could arrange a more detailed briefing on these opportunities. I'd like to understand the full scope of what you're proposing." Harrison's expression brightened, and Marcus realized they had successfully convinced him that the king was receptive to corruption. "Excellent, Your Majesty. I can arrange a meeting with some key partners later this week, discreet individuals who understand the delicate nature of international finance." The phrase, discreet individuals, sent chills through Marcus. These would be the shadowy figures behind the conspiracy, the ones with the real power to make kings and destroy kingdoms. Meeting with them would either provide crucial evidence or lead to their immediate elimination. As the briefing concluded, Harrison's parting words carried an unmistakable undertone of threat disguised as friendly advice. "Your Majesty, I cannot stress enough the importance of unity during these challenging times. It would be unfortunate if internal disagreements were to undermine the stability we've worked so hard to maintain." After the general left, the three conspirators remained in tense silence for several minutes. The performance had been successful, but it had also committed them to a course of action that grew more dangerous with each step. "He bought it," Isabella said finally. "But that meeting he's arranging will be a trap. They'll want to test your commitment, probably by asking you to authorize something irreversible." King Alexander stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the gardens where tourists gathered to catch glimpses of royalty. "Then we need to be ready with evidence before that meeting takes place. Marcus, can your trusted men gather intelligence without arousing suspicion?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Some of them, yes, but we'll need to be extremely careful about what we ask and how we ask it. One wrong move and the entire conspiracy collapses on top of us." The king turned back to face them, and Marcus was struck by how much Alexander had aged in the space of a single morning. The carefree prince was gone completely, replaced by a monarch who understood the weight of impossible choices. "Then we begin immediately," the king said. "We have perhaps 72 hours before Harrison expects another meeting. In that time, we need to gather enough evidence to expose the conspiracy or find enough leverage to destroy it from within." Isabella's next words reminded them all of what failure would mean. "And if we can't do either?" King Alexander's response was delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who had accepted his fate. "Then we ensure the truth survives, even if we don't." Outside, the tourists continued their happy chatter, unaware that their kingdom balanced on the edge of a knife, and that three desperate conspirators in a blood-stained study held the only hope of preventing its fall into darkness. The first 48 hours of their investigation unfolded like a carefully orchestrated ballet of deception and discovery. Marcus had assembled his most trusted men under the pretense of conducting enhanced security reviews, while King Alexander maintained his regular schedule with the performance of a lifetime. Isabella proved to be an invaluable asset, using her aristocratic connections to gather intelligence from the wives and families of suspected conspirators. Marcus's first breakthrough came from Sergeant Davies, a 20-year veteran whose loyalty was beyond question. Davies had noticed unusual patterns in the duty rosters over the past 6 months. Certain guards consistently assigned to specific areas during particular shifts, communications equipment being tested at odd hours, and private meetings in sections of the palace that were supposedly empty. "Sir," Davies reported during a clandestine meeting in the palace's old wine cellar, "I've mapped the pattern, and it's not random. Someone's been creating isolated zones where they can move freely without oversight. Last Tuesday, the entire East Wing was cleared of regular patrols for 3 hours under the guise of maintenance work." Marcus studied the hand-drawn map Davies had prepared, noting the strategic importance of the areas in question. The East Wing housed the communications center, the document archives, and several secure meeting rooms used for sensitive government business. "Who authorized the clearances?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Lieutenant Crawford, sir. Always Lieutenant Crawford." The confirmation of his second-in-command's betrayal hit Marcus harder than he had expected. Crawford had been more than just a colleague. They had shared dangers, celebrations, and the quiet camaraderie of men who trusted each other with their lives. The personal betrayal stung almost as much as the professional implications. Meanwhile, Isabella had been conducting her own investigation through the intricate network of palace social events and aristocratic gatherings. Her position as Queen Consort gave her access to conversations that others might never hear, and her reputation for charity work made her presence at various functions seem natural rather than suspicious. During a luncheon with the wives of several high-ranking military officers, Isabella discovered that General Harrison had been hosting private dinner parties at his estate for the past year. The guest lists for these gatherings read like a who's who of military leadership, defense contractors, and international businessmen. Margaret Harrison let slip that they're expecting some very important foreign guests next week, Isabella reported to the king during one of their carefully orchestrated private moments. She was practically glowing about the opportunity to entertain such distinguished visitors, though she was maddeningly vague about who they might be. King Alexander had been playing his own dangerous game, appearing increasingly receptive to General Harrison's suggestions while carefully documenting every conversation. His natural intelligence and years of diplomatic training served him well as he walked the tightrope between gaining the general's trust and maintaining his own moral integrity. "Harrison is growing bolder," the king reported during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Today he suggested that we might need to consider restructuring some government departments to improve efficiency. When I asked for specifics, he mentioned that the Treasury and Foreign Affairs ministries might benefit from more military oversight." Marcus understood the implications immediately. He's preparing for the transition. Once he has control of the Treasury and foreign policy, the coup becomes a fait accompli. The pressure of maintaining their deception was beginning to take its toll on all three conspirators. Isabella had developed dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights, while the king's natural charisma was becoming strained around the edges. Marcus found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering which of his colleagues might be reporting his activities to the enemy. Their investigation took a dangerous turn when Marcus decided to conduct a covert search of Lieutenant Crawford's quarters. Using his master access codes, he entered Crawford's apartment in the Palace Guard housing complex during a shift change when he knew his target would be occupied elsewhere. What Marcus discovered exceeded his worst fears. Hidden behind a false panel in Crawford's closet was a sophisticated communication setup, complete with encrypted radios, coded message books, and detailed floor plans of the palace with security vulnerabilities clearly marked. Most damning of all was a list of guard personnel with notations indicating their loyalty status and potential usefulness to the conspiracy. Marcus's own name appeared on the list with a red mark and the notation, "Eliminate when transition begins." The cold calculation of his planned murder sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the window. Even more disturbing were the financial records Crawford had apparently been keeping. Bank statements showed regular deposits from shell companies that Marcus recognized from Isabella's intelligence gathering. Crawford wasn't just a military conspirator. He was being paid handsomely for his betrayal. Among the papers, Marcus found evidence that the conspiracy extended far beyond what they had initially suspected. There were references to operations in 6 different countries, arms shipments to conflict zones, and what appeared to be plans for assassinating political figures who opposed the network's interests. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. This wasn't just about seizing control of one kingdom. It was about creating a multinational network of military-industrial cooperation that would reshape global politics. Marcus photographed the evidence with a small camera he had borrowed from the palace security office, working quickly to document everything before Crawford's return. As he prepared to leave, he noticed a folder marked with the current date and the king's name. Inside, he found a detailed plan for King Alexander's assassination, scheduled to take place during a public appearance the following week. The method was coldly professional, a sniper positioned in a building across from the ceremony site, with the gunman's escape route carefully planned and multiple backup shooters in position. The discovery that they had less than a week to prevent the king's murder transformed their investigation from a race for evidence into a desperate fight for survival. Marcus immediately contacted Isabella through their prearranged signals, and an emergency meeting was called in the Queen's private chambers. "They're not waiting for the meeting with the foreign partners," Marcus reported grimly. "They're moving to eliminate Alexander first, then dealing with the political fallout afterward." Isabella's face went ashen as she absorbed the implications. If they kill Alexander, they can claim he was assassinated by foreign agents or domestic terrorists. The military would naturally assume emergency powers to maintain stability. King Alexander's response surprised both of his co-conspirators. Rather than showing fear, he displayed a cold anger that reminded them both that he was the descendant of kings who had faced down enemies for centuries. "Then we accelerate our own timeline," the king said firmly. "Marcus, how quickly can you gather your loyal men for a decisive action?" "6 hours, Your Majesty, but what kind of action are you considering?" The king stood and walked to his safe, retrieving a folder that Marcus had never seen before. "My father wasn't entirely corrupted by Harrison's network. Before his death, he was preparing his own counteraction. This contains evidence he gathered, including recordings of conversations with General Harrison that prove treason." Isabella leaned forward in surprise. "You've had evidence all along. Why didn't you use it immediately?" "Because my father's evidence alone wouldn't have been enough to root out the entire conspiracy. We needed to identify all the players, understand the full scope of the operation, and gather enough proof to ensure that when we struck, we eliminated the threat completely." Marcus studied the contents of the folder with growing amazement. The old king had been far more cunning than anyone had suspected, playing a long game that extended beyond his own death. Audio recordings, financial documents, and personal correspondence painted a complete picture of the conspiracy's development over several years. "This changes everything," Marcus said. "With this evidence combined with what we've gathered, we can expose the entire network, but we need to move before the assassination attempt." King Alexander nodded. "I propose we turn the tables completely. Tomorrow, I'll announce a special ceremony to honor military service, with General Harrison as the guest of honor. We'll use the occasion to present our evidence publicly, with full media coverage." Isabella saw the flaw in the plan immediately. "They'll never allow you to reach the podium alive. The moment they realize what you're planning, the assassination timeline will be moved up." "Not if we control the narrative from the beginning," the king replied. "Marcus, your loyal guards will secure the venue. Isabella, you'll use your social connections to ensure that key international observers are present, and I'll deliver a speech that exposes everything while the world is watching." The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness, but Marcus could see the logic behind it. By making the revelations public in a controlled environment with international witnesses, they would make it impossible for the military to suppress the information or claim the evidence was fabricated. However, the risks were enormous. If any part of the plan failed, if they had underestimated the conspiracy's reach or overestimated their own capabilities, they would all be dead within hours. Isabella raised another concern that Marcus hadn't considered. What about my family? The moment you expose Harrison's network, they'll be targeted for elimination. My brother, my cousins, even distant relatives who had nothing to do with the conspiracy. King Alexander's expression softened as he considered his wife's anguish. We'll offer them protection in exchange for cooperation. Those who were coerced can be forgiven. Those who actively participated will face justice. Marcus was already thinking through the logistics of the operation. We'll need to coordinate with elements outside the palace, police units we can trust, perhaps some military officers who aren't part of the conspiracy. This can't be just a palace guard action. The king nodded. I have contacts in the intelligence services who have been investigating irregularities in military procurement. They'll provide backup if we give them enough evidence to justify action. As they finalized their desperate plan, each of them understood that they were committing to a course of action that would either save the kingdom or destroy them all. The weight of history pressed down upon them, but so did the knowledge that failure meant not just their own deaths, but the transformation of their homeland into something unrecognizable. Isabella's final words before they separated captured the magnitude of what they faced. Tomorrow we either become heroes or we become martyrs. I pray we're brave enough to accept either outcome. Outside the palace walls, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that its fate would be decided in the next 24 hours by three conspirators who had stumbled into a web of corruption that reached across continents. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the future of a kingdom, but the balance of power in a world where shadows had grown too long and secrets had become too dangerous to keep. The morning of the confrontation dawned gray and cold, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the tension gripping the palace. Marcus had spent the night positioning his trusted men throughout the ceremonial hall, each one briefed on their specific role in what might be their final operation. The ceremony honoring military service had been announced with only 18 hours' notice, but the king's reputation for spontaneous gestures made the short timeline seem plausible rather than suspicious. Isabella had worked throughout the night to ensure the presence of international observers, using her network of diplomatic wives and cultural attachés to generate interest in what she described as a significant royal announcement. By dawn, representatives from 12 foreign embassies had confirmed their attendance, along with several international journalists who sensed a story developing. King Alexander spent his final hours before the ceremony reviewing his father's hidden files, memorizing names, dates, and financial details that would form the backbone of his explosive revelations. The weight of the evidence was staggering: bank transfers totaling hundreds of millions of pounds, arms shipment manifests to war zones, and audio recordings that captured General Harrison discussing the elimination of political opponents with chilling casualness. The ceremonial hall had been chosen specifically for its symbolic significance and tactical advantages. The grand chamber, where kings had been crowned for centuries, would serve as the stage for either the monarchy's salvation or its final act. Marcus's men controlled every entrance, while hidden cameras would broadcast the proceedings live to prevent any attempt to suppress the revelations. General Harrison arrived precisely on schedule, resplendent in his dress uniform and accompanied by a delegation of senior military officers. Marcus noted that several of these men appeared on the conspiracy's personnel lists, their presence serving as both an honor guard and a potential threat. The general's confident bearing suggested he had no suspicion of what was about to unfold. "Your Majesty," Harrison greeted the king with a crisp salute and what appeared to be genuine warmth. "This is an unexpected honor. I had no idea you were planning such a ceremony." King Alexander's response was perfectly calibrated to maintain the deception until the crucial moment. "General, your service to the crown deserves recognition, and I felt it important to acknowledge your contributions publicly. I hope you don't mind the short notice." Isabella stood beside her husband, playing her role as the supportive consort with consummate skill. Her smile was radiant, her posture perfect, giving no hint of the violence that had erupted between them just days earlier or the desperate gamble they were about to undertake. The assembled guests filled the ceremonial hall's ornate chairs, creating an atmosphere of dignified expectation. International diplomats chatted quietly with palace officials, while journalists checked their recording equipment and photographers positioned themselves for optimal angles. The scene was picture-perfect, a tableau of royal tradition and military honor. Marcus positioned himself near the podium, close enough to protect the king, but far enough away to avoid appearing threatening to the assembled military officers. His earpiece crackled with periodic updates from his men stationed throughout the building, confirming that all positions were secure and no unusual activity had been detected. The ceremony began with traditional pomp and circumstance. A military band played the national anthem, followed by an honor guard presentation of colors that had been carried in campaigns dating back centuries. The pageantry served to lull the conspirators into believing this was indeed a routine royal event. King Alexander took the podium with the easy grace he had perfected over years of public appearances. His opening remarks were conventional, praising the dedication of military service and the honor of those who served the crown. General Harrison and his colleagues nodded approvingly, seeing nothing beyond the expected royal platitudes. Today, the king continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's excellent acoustics, I want to speak about honor, duty, and the sacred trust between those who serve and those who lead. These concepts form the foundation of our democracy and the bedrock of our national identity. Marcus could see some of the conspirators beginning to relax, interpreting the king's words as the standard rhetoric they had heard countless times before. General Harrison's expression was benign, even pleased, as he anticipated what he assumed would be public recognition of his contributions to the kingdom. The king's tone began to shift, becoming more serious and pointed. However, I must also address the reality that these sacred trusts can be betrayed, that those who swear oaths of loyalty sometimes pursue private interests at the expense of public good. A subtle tension began to ripple through the assembled military officers. General Harrison's smile became slightly fixed, though he maintained his composure with the skill of a career soldier and politician. Isabella's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her small purse, which contained copies of the most damning evidence should they need to distribute proof immediately. My father, the late king, was not perfect, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger and more commanding. But in his final months, he recognized that elements within our own government had become corrupted by foreign interests and personal greed. Before his death, he began documenting these betrayals, gathering evidence of crimes that strike at the very heart of our sovereignty. The atmosphere in the hall shifted dramatically. Conversations ceased, cameras focused more intently on the podium, and several of the military officers exchanged sharp glances. General Harrison's composure was beginning to crack, his jaw tightening as he realized the ceremony was not proceeding as expected. King Alexander reached beneath the podium and retrieved a thick folder that made several conspirators visibly tense. This evidence documents a conspiracy involving arms trafficking, money laundering, election interference in allied nations, and plans for the violent overthrow of our constitutional government. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. General Harrison half rose from his seat, his face flushing with what could have been either anger or fear. Several international diplomats leaned forward, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a ceremonial military tribute. The conspiracy, the king continued relentlessly, involves senior military officers, defense contractors, foreign intelligence services, and individuals who have sworn sacred oaths to protect this nation while secretly working to subvert it. Marcus watched the room's dynamics shift as the implications of the king's words sank in. Some officers appeared genuinely shocked, their surprise seeming to confirm their innocence. Others displayed the carefully controlled expressions of trained professionals who had just realized their cover was blown. General Harrison found his voice, standing fully and addressing the king with barely contained fury. Your Majesty, these are serious accusations that require serious evidence. I hope you understand the implications of what you're suggesting. King Alexander's response was delivered with the quiet authority of a monarch who had accepted the full weight of his crown. General Harrison, I understand the implications perfectly. That's why I'm presenting the evidence publicly with international witnesses to ensure that justice cannot be perverted or suppressed." The king gestured to Marcus, who activated a large screen that had been positioned for what guests had assumed would be a ceremonial presentation. Instead, bank account records appeared, showing massive transfers between offshore accounts and companies controlled by conspirators in the room. "These financial records," the king announced, "document the illegal transfer of funds intended for national defense to private accounts controlled by a network of military officers and their business partners." General Harrison's face had gone from flushed to pale as the scope of the evidence became clear. "This is fabricated," he declared, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "These documents have been manufactured to support a false narrative." Isabella chose that moment to stand, her movement graceful but purposeful. "General, would you like to hear your own voice discussing these transactions? We have audio recordings of your conversations with my father regarding the establishment of the offshore accounts." The Queen Consort's words delivered a psychological blow that was visible in Harrison's reaction. The realization that his own voice might be about to condemn him caused a momentary loss of composure that confirmed his guilt to everyone in the room. King Alexander advanced to the next phase of his presentation, displaying communications between Harrison and foreign contacts that detailed plans for destabilizing allied governments to create opportunities for arms sales and military intervention. "This correspondence," the king explained, "shows systematic efforts to create conflicts that would generate profits for companies owned or controlled by members of this conspiracy. The cost in human lives was considered an acceptable price for financial gain." Several international diplomats began taking urgent notes, realizing they were witnessing evidence of crimes that affected their own nations. The journalists present understood they were covering a story that would dominate headlines worldwide. Marcus noticed increased radio chatter in his earpiece, indicating that Harrison's allies were beginning to coordinate some form of response. The moment of revelation was passing, and the window for action was narrowing rapidly. The king's voice grew harder as he approached the climax of his presentation. "Most disturbing of all is evidence of plans to assassinate elected officials, including members of parliament who were investigating irregularities in military procurement." A new document appeared on the screen, showing detailed assassination plans with Harrison's signature clearly visible. The general's response was immediate and telling. Instead of demanding to examine the evidence or protesting its authenticity, he began looking toward the exits, calculating his options for escape. "Furthermore," King Alexander continued, "we have documentation of plans for a military coup designed to eliminate constitutional government and install a military administration controlled by this conspiracy." The final piece of evidence was the most damning: audio recordings of Harrison discussing the timing and methods for seizing control of the government. His own voice filled the ceremonial hall, cold and calculating, as he described the elimination of opposition figures and the suspension of democratic institutions. The effect on the assembled audience was electric. Several military officers immediately stood and began distancing themselves from Harrison and his known associates. International observers activated communication devices to alert their governments to the unfolding crisis. Journalists began transmitting reports of the extraordinary revelations. General Harrison's response was swift and desperate. He activated a small device he had been carrying, sending a signal to whatever forces he had positioned around the palace. Almost immediately, Marcus heard reports through his earpiece of armed men attempting to enter the building. "Your Majesty," Harrison said with cold fury, "you've just signed your own death warrant. This evidence will never leave this room, and you'll never leave this building alive." The general's words were met by the distinctive sound of weapons being readied as Marcus's loyal guards moved to protective positions around the king and queen. The ceremonial hall, moments before a picture of royal dignity, had become a battleground where the future of the kingdom would be decided. Isabella stepped closer to her husband, her earlier fear replaced by a steely determination that surprised even Marcus. "General, you seem to have forgotten that this ceremony is being broadcast live to news organizations around the world. Your threats are now part of the public record." The revelation that the proceedings were being transmitted beyond the palace walls hit Harrison like a physical blow. His conspiracy had depended on controlling information and eliminating witnesses, but now the evidence and his own incriminating response were spreading beyond his reach. King Alexander's final words before the violence began were delivered with the calm certainty of a monarch who had chosen principle over survival. "The truth is now public, General Harrison. Whatever happens to us, your conspiracy has been exposed, and your network will be hunted down." Outside the ceremonial hall, sirens could be heard approaching as loyal elements of the police and military responded to the crisis. The palace had become the epicenter of a battle between constitutional government and military conspiracy, with three unlikely heroes having lit the fuse that would either save their nation or destroy it completely. The moment of truth had arrived, and history would record whether courage and principle could triumph over corruption and violence in a kingdom that balanced on the edge of civil war. The battle for the palace unfolded with the intensity of a military operation and the desperation of cornered conspirators fighting for their lives. General Harrison's emergency signal had activated sleeper cells throughout the capital, but Marcus's careful preparation and the king's strategic timing had tipped the balance in favor of constitutional government. The first wave of Harrison's forces attempted to storm the ceremonial hall through the main entrances, only to find themselves facing Marcus's hand-picked guards who had been positioned with specific knowledge of the building's defensive advantages. The ancient stone walls that had protected kings for centuries now sheltered democracy itself, as gunfire echoed through corridors that had witnessed coronations and state ceremonies. Inside the hall, the international diplomats and journalists found themselves trapped in the center of a constitutional crisis that was playing out with deadly force. Several foreign representatives immediately began broadcasting reports to their governments, while journalists continued transmitting despite the obvious danger. The live coverage that Isabella had arranged was serving its purpose, making it impossible for Harrison to contain the story even if he won the immediate battle. King Alexander refused to take shelter, standing beside the podium where he had delivered the revelations that had triggered the crisis. His calm presence in the face of violence served to steady the civilians in the room and inspire the guards who were defending them. Isabella remained at his side, her aristocratic composure intact even as bullets shattered windows and armed men battled just outside the hall's massive doors. Marcus coordinated the defense through his earpiece, directing his men to choke points where they could maximize their effectiveness against superior numbers. The palace's ancient architecture, with its narrow passages and multiple levels, favored defenders who knew the building intimately over attackers who were operating from hastily drawn plans. "Sergeant Davies reports the East Wing is secure," Marcus announced to the king. "The communications center is still operational, and our broadcasts are reaching international networks." Harrison's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully planned coup was disintegrating into a public relations disaster. The evidence of his conspiracy was spreading across global news networks, while his attempt to silence the revelations through force was being broadcast in real time. "You have no idea what you've done," Harrison snarled at the king. "This conspiracy exists because it's necessary. The world is more dangerous than you understand, and sometimes protection requires methods that naive idealists can't accept." King Alexander's response revealed the depth of his transformation from protected prince to decisive monarch. "Protection built on murder and corruption isn't protection at all, General. It's tyranny disguised as patriotism." The philosophical debate was interrupted by reports that loyal elements of the military were beginning to respond to the crisis. Units that had been stationed outside the capital were mobilizing to support the legitimate government, while police forces were engaging Harrison's paramilitaries in street battles throughout the city. Isabella's network of social connections proved crucial as diplomatic wives and international business leaders began pressuring their governments to intervene. The Queen Consort had transformed her charity work and social gatherings into an intelligence network that now served to mobilize international support for constitutional government. The tide began to turn when Colonel Margaret Sinclair, commander of the Royal Artillery Regiment, arrived at the palace with a full company of soldiers whose loyalty to the crown was absolute. Sinclair was a career officer whose reputation was beyond reproach, and her support provided the military legitimacy that Harrison's conspiracy had tried to claim. "Your Majesty," Sinclair announced as her troops secured the palace perimeter. The legitimate government of this kingdom stands ready to defend constitutional order against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The arrival of loyalist forces marked the beginning of Harrison's collapse. His network of conspirators, faced with the choice between continued resistance and surrender, began to fracture as individual officers chose survival over conspiracy. Lieutenant Crawford, Marcus's former second-in-command, was among the first to attempt to switch sides. His approach to Marcus carried the desperation of a man who realized his betrayal had been discovered and his life now hung in the balance. "Captain Thornfield," Crawford said, his weapon lowered in a gesture of surrender, "I want to cooperate fully with the investigation. There are things about this conspiracy that even you don't understand." Marcus's response was cold and professional. "The time for cooperation was before you sold out your oath and your comrades. Now you'll face justice like everyone else involved in this treason." The intelligence that Crawford and other surrendering conspirators provided painted an even darker picture of the network's scope and ambitions. The conspiracy had tentacles reaching into intelligence services, defense contractors, and foreign governments across 3 continents. The arms deals were just one component of a larger plan to destabilize democratic institutions and replace them with military corporate alliances. Harrison himself remained defiant even as his position became hopeless. Surrounded by loyal troops and facing the prospect of life imprisonment or execution for treason, he continued to justify his actions as necessary for national survival. "You think you've won?" Harrison told the king as military police placed him under arrest. "But this network exists because the world requires it. Without us, your precious democracy will be devoured by enemies who understand power better than you do." King Alexander's final words to the disgraced general summarized the moral clarity that had driven their desperate gamble. "General, the enemies of democracy aren't the foreign powers you claim to fight. They're the people who believe that fear justifies abandoning the principles that make freedom worth defending." The immediate crisis was resolved within 6 hours, but the investigation that followed revealed the true scope of what they had faced. International cooperation uncovered similar networks in dozens of countries, all connected through financial arrangements and strategic alliances that had operated in shadows for decades. Isabella's role in the conspiracy's exposure earned her a unique place in history. The aristocrat who had been willing to strike her husband to preserve corrupt stability had transformed into a champion of transparency and justice. Her testimony before parliamentary committees and international tribunals helped dismantle networks that had influenced global politics for years. Marcus found himself promoted to head of a new royal protection service, tasked with preventing similar conspiracies from taking root. His experience had taught him that the greatest threats to constitutional government often came from within, from those who swore sacred oaths while pursuing private interests. The evidence gathered during the crisis led to prosecutions in multiple countries and the exposure of corruption that reached into the highest levels of several governments. Arms dealers who had profited from manufactured conflicts faced justice, while political figures who had sold their influence to foreign interests were removed from power. King Alexander's reign was transformed by the crisis. The monarch who had been seen as young and untested emerged as a figure of international respect, a leader who had chosen principle over personal safety and democratic values over expedient compromise. His marriage to Isabella was strengthened by their shared ordeal, creating a partnership built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. The palace itself was renovated and secured, with new procedures designed to prevent future infiltration by hostile forces. The ceremonial hall where the truth had been revealed became a symbol of democratic resilience, a place where transparency had triumphed over conspiracy. Years later, historians would analyze the crisis as a turning point in the struggle between democratic institutions and shadowy networks that sought to manipulate global politics. The courage of 3 unlikely allies, a loyal guard, a conflicted queen, and a determined king, had prevented the transformation of a constitutional monarchy into a military dictatorship. The international ramifications continued for years as investigations uncovered the full extent of the conspiracy's reach. Defense contractors lost billions in illegal profits, corrupt officials faced justice, and democratic institutions were strengthened by the exposure of vulnerabilities that had been exploited by hostile forces. Marcus never forgot the moment in the blood-stained study when he had been forced to choose between loyalty to individuals and loyalty to principles. His decision to trust the king and queen, despite witnessing their violent confrontation, had ultimately saved not just their lives, but the constitutional order they had sworn to protect. Isabella's transformation from conspirator to champion remained one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire affair. The woman who had been willing to use violence to preserve corrupt stability became an advocate for transparency and accountability who worked tirelessly to prevent similar conspiracies from taking root. King Alexander's legacy was secured by his willingness to risk everything for the truth. The monarch who could have chosen comfortable compromise over dangerous principle became a symbol of democratic courage that inspired leaders around the world to stand up to corruption within their own governments. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful and well-established crumbled once exposed to public scrutiny. The network of corruption that had operated in shadows for decades could not survive the light of international attention and democratic accountability. The palace grounds where tourists had once gathered to catch glimpses of royalty became a symbol of constitutional resilience, a place where ordinary people could visit and see where democracy had been tested and had prevailed. The ceremonial hall hosted regular tours that told the story of how truth had triumphed over conspiracy. In the end, the crisis revealed that democracy's greatest strength was not its institutions or procedures, but the courage of individuals who were willing to defend it when it came under attack. Three unlikely heroes, brought together by chance and bound by principle, had shown that no conspiracy was too powerful to defeat when confronted by determined people willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. The kingdom emerged from its trials stronger and more vigilant, with institutions that had been tested by fire and proven capable of defending themselves against enemies both foreign and domestic. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy constitutional government had instead strengthened it, creating safeguards and awareness that would protect future generations from similar threats. The story became a testament to the power of ordinary people to shape history when they choose courage over comfort and principle over expedience. In a world where shadows seemed to grow longer and secrets more dangerous, three conspirators for justice had proven that light could still triumph over darkness when brave people were willing to strike the match.